Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Lemerack and this is my ongoing series on Kerbal Space Program, in which before the release of Kerbal Space Program 2 I attempt to do most of the things in Kerbal Space Program 1 that I have not done so far, specifically visiting most of the planets and other celestial bodies that I have not yet visited. In today's playthrough we're going to be crossing Duna off of that list. Now I have been to Duna in the past, but as the hallmark of the series is just visiting all the places, all the significant places in the Kerbal system. Figured it's good to get that off the list because it's an easy one. It's one that we can get done fairly quickly and fairly easily, but I am trying to put a little bit of spice into it. As you can see, the craft being constructed. This is probably the most complex, one might easily argue needlessly complex, Duna landers I have constructed so far, and in fact, spacecraft that I have constructed so far. It is composed of a top section that splits into two halves. It's going to be used for landing and taking off from the surface of the planet, and then you've got the mid-section, which is going to carry the crew during transit, and then of course the bottom section, which is the fuel and propulsion systems. And the entire thing is mounted on a giant Saturn-sized rocket to put it into orbit. The spacecraft in this case is not going to be recoverable, in the sense that we're not going to be bringing it back into atmospheric flight, nor is the rocket going to be, because this is a spacecraft that we're only going to send up once. This is not a frequently reused vessel. I don't actually intend to use this vessel more than once now that I've finished the playthrough, as we observe the takeoff, but I did design it in such a way that it is meant to make multiple trips. It is going to be sent up to the space station, and then once it's up at the space station it's going to dock with it, and then it can be refueled, and it has enough delta V to perform another docking and rendezvous maneuver when it comes back from Duna. Again, we are currently observing the part of the flight where the main stage depletes its fuel, and we switch over to the secondary, the next stage, in order to put it into a safe, high parking orbit. I probably put... There's needless complexity in this mission. It can be done a lot easier, but I like to play my Kerbal Space Program missions in such a way that they at least look like they could be a real space mission. So it's like I said, this is gonna... This flight that we're watching right now is just going to be our approach to the space station, where we're going to be docking it, and then all the crew is going to make a separate trip in order to get on board the vessel and take it to Duna itself. In the meantime, just a quick briefing on the subject. I'm not entirely sure where we are in the footage as I'm recording this narration right now, because in the preview image I'm still watching the construction. It's weird the way this works, but the central stage is fully recoverable. It's equipped with parachutes and everything to make a proper re-entry. The bottom stage is not, obviously, but yeah, I'm still trying very hard. This is the first time I've ever done this particular thing in a Kerbal Space Program playthrough, but I am playing the game in such a way that we are not going to leave debris in space anywhere. That includes fairing debris. So I tend to design most of my new rockets with recoverable stages as much as possible. Similarly, if I can, on the frequently used spacecraft, I also intend on using recoverable boosters now that I know how to do that. But I can already tell ahead of time that this spacecraft is probably going to end up returning to... We're going to deorbit it soon, because I don't think this is a vessel that we're going to be able to use to visit other planets as well. Excuse me. Anyway, what else to talk about? I'm currently watching the deorbit of the central core, rather the central stage. I'm trying to decipher by looking at the timeline where the other half of this video is at the current moment. Valentina is piloting the vessel up to its rendezvous and docking with the space station. Space station, which by the way is chock full mostly of liquid fuel, specifically because these are the types of spaceships I intend to be docking here. Speaking of which, we now get to watch the rendezvous and docking maneuver, my preview image is caught up to the actual footage. We get to watch it sped up. You'll notice that it has 2 docking ports. It's because this is a very configurable vessel. And the vessel itself isn't actually fully reusable, at least not as a lander. It can make multiple trips to Duna, but in order to make multiple landings on Duna, it's going to need resupply from Kerbal, because one of its stages is not going to be coming back with it from Duna. Again, this will all make sense as soon as we actually get to witness it. So here we get to watch the completion of the docking maneuver. We use the rear docking port to connect it there, just that the nose is facing outward. And then the next stage of this mission, now that the spacecraft is up there, is to bring the crew. And for the crew, we're going to use my completely originally named, absolutely not stolen Drake spacecraft, which is not an analog of anything in the real life. It's entirely my own invention. And again, if you're watching one of my videos for the first time, then this is basically the way I make fully recoverable spacecraft. This is a SpaceX-style landing booster. And you can do it in Kerbal Space Program if you're in like career mode or something and want to fully recover your things. You just have to time it properly. And the way I do it is I build my rocket so that the first stage has around 2,200 meters per second of delta V, use some pretty strong boosters, and launch the craft up to about a 90-kilometer apoapsis to be safe. You can make it lower if you want to, conserve fuel, but 90 is a nice safe altitude. Then you perform a boost back burn. If you're using Kerbal Engineer, you can click the land button on the right side. You can see it there, and that will give you a nice little target to show you where the booster is going to land. After you perform your boost back, which is you turn the rocket in the other direction and target the Kerbal Space Center with what fuel you have left, then you put it in its proper orientation, and then quickly switch back to the top stage, as you can see right now. Use the top stage's orbital insertion engine just to give it a parking orbit. Don't worry about performing a rendezvous or getting to your destination. Just put it into a safe altitude where it's not going to fall back down to the surface. And then once you're done with that, as soon as you can, switch back to the main booster, preferably before it falls back into the atmosphere. In previous versions of Kerbal Space Program, you were not able to switch back to vessels that were in the atmosphere if you'd switched off them previously. Recently, I don't know if that's still a thing, but just try to do it before that. It should work out. As you can see, there's usually plenty of time to do it. The aero brakes that you can attach to the top sort of serve the function of the SpaceX-style grid fins. Generally, if you want to perform a perfect suicide burn, the minimum amount of fuel that you're going to require, because the aerodynamics are going to slow the booster down to about 250 meters per second, without doing anything. So around 300 meters per second of delta V is what you need to perform the suicide burn if you're absolutely min-maxing. If you're like me, then you like to leave a little bit of extra fuel in there to make sure that your landing is nice and controlled. And then, using the landing legs, give it a nice and gentle landing, and there you have it. It's a fully recovered SpaceX-style central core. And now that with that done, we can go back up to the main spacecraft. I perform a similar maneuver with the second central core, which you can also recover. And even if you're not going to recover it, at least we're going to deorbit it, because again, we're not leaving debris in space. Also a good tip, if you're landing a booster like this and you haven't put landing legs on its butt, then generally you might want to not do what I'm doing and aim for the ocean. Just try to hit some kind of watery surface, because if you try to land this thing on its engine, then it might tip over, and there's always a chance when it tips over that bits are going to break off and explode, and then your recovery will not be successful. Also, you might need to be prepared that if you don't put enough parachutes on there, it might need a little bit of assistance from its engine. But in my case, 6 parachutes is more than enough to get a safe recovery. And then here we get to watch the approach and the docking of the Drake with the space station, carrying the crew for the Duna Explorer. I edited out a standard rendezvous and docking maneuver. You're watching the docking, but the rendezvous I edited out because it's really just a little bit of fiddling around in low Kerbal orbit in order to you know, just kind of match up the trajectories in order to get an encounter and then sort of adjust. Now, in order to get to Duna, there's a website I use where I just get to look this kind of stuff up. But you should just be able to type in like KSP angles in Google and you'll get a result. You need to look for a transfer window to Duna. And the best way to do that, what you're looking for is if you were to draw an imaginary line from Kerbin to the sun and then from the sun to Duna, then the angle that those two lines should close together is about 30, between like 35 and 45 degrees. Again, look it up for the exact number. I can't remember it exactly by heart. And then once you're done with that, then because Duna is on a higher orbit around the sun than Kerbin is, you're going to want to burn on the far side of Kerbin. So that is the side that is further away from the sun. Because again, you're trying to speed up your orbit both around Kerbin and around the sun. And so in order to do that, you want to be burning in the prograde vector relative both to Kerbin and to the sun. Here you can see me fiddling around with the maneuver node in order to try and get a encounter that is, I can't remember exactly what number I was aiming for, but I probably ended up putting it into about a 90 kilometer periapsis, or like the closest approach. You can use arrow braking as a possibility around Duna. You can technically aim for within Duna's atmosphere. Duna's atmosphere extends up to about 60 kilometers, I think. And if you get up that high, or that low rather, then you can use the aerodynamics to give you a little bit of extra friction to help slow you down. That means you have to, in general, use less fuel. This ship is using nuclear engines, so all the burns it performs are pretty long, obviously. I get to wave goodbye to Kerbin for a good couple of years until this crew gets to return. Luckily, Kerbals do not age, they do not get bored, and they also do not atrophy because all that time spent in microgravity and then in the lower gravity of Duna would make returning home from Kerbin a bit difficult. But anyway, roughly around the, I should have sped this up, I don't know why I let this go so slow, but roughly around the 90-degree angle, like again, if you draw a line, an imaginary line from the vessel to the sun and then to Duna, roughly when we get to about 90 degrees on that imaginary line, then I'm going to perform a course correction to try and get us as close to Duna as we can. This is not going to take necessarily long. For some reason, the camera didn't want to focus back on the spacecraft after I switched it around. This is me already performing the burn. That little wobble there is due to the fact that there are a bunch of RCS thrusters on the side, and when I decided to try and conserve some of the liquid fuel and use the monopropellant to perform the rest of the correction, then a lot of the side-mounted RCS thrusters started to go crazy. That's what caused all that quivering around there. So then in the end, I did end up using the liquid fuel engines just to make sure that our course alteration was steady. There we go. Again, I can't quite see that number in the preview screen, but, you know, you can generally go a little bit closer than you would on Kerbin because the atmosphere is lower. It's also a lot less dense. Duna is a pretty easy planet to visit, so it's apt that this is the first interplanetary target that most people tend to choose because it's pretty easy to visit. Here we get to watch the approach, which is really beautiful. Sometimes words just can't describe how much I love this game. And I'm sure you can't really tell just how touched I get every time I see a beautiful sight in this game like that. But anyway, I ran into a little bit of a bug here. The Kraken ended up destroying my vessel at least twice because I accelerated I did a time warp during the burn again because these nuclear engines have very low thrust to weight ratio, and I'm a super impatient person by nature. So when during the burn I started to turn on the physics warp, what ended up happening is for some reason the engine started to wobble, and just destroyed the craft. You're not going to get to see the destruction. I edited that out, but you will get to see a little bit of the wobble in just a second as we make our approach and prepare to initiate our Duna orbit injection burn. All our Kerbals looking very happy down there in the corner to finally get to their first interplanetary target. And here we go. There was the edit, so you missed a couple of hilarious explosions. But in just a second, we're going to initiate the burn. There we go. And then, just because I am super impatient, I'm going to hit the physics warp button in a sec, hoping that everything will work out well this time. In the meantime, we get a nice little cockpit view of the surface of the planet. This is what they get to see. The Kerbals get to see of the trip. It's pretty. It's definitely very pretty. Come on, let's see the wobble. I want to see the wobble. I'm just really running out of things to talk about. There's not a lot of interesting things happening during these very, very long burns, so I might end up editing out more of these in the future. There we go. There's the quake. This time, before it gets out of hand, I switch it off, and then usually when the physics warps is disabled, everything that was about to tear your vessel apart just kind of stops. So we get to watch this burn occur in real time right now. Again, because for some reason I didn't bother to edit all this out, but don't worry, you get to look at the beautiful surface of Duna in the meantime. I'm also kind of scouting out where I might want to land. In retrospect, I think that I vastly over-engineered my lander. I usually operate on a cheat sheet that I have open while I'm playing Kerbal Space Program that gives me a very nice little summation of the amount of delta V required to get to various points in the Kerbal system. And when I was building the lander and I finished building that stage, right, like I put the little Rockomax engine and the 4 side-mounted boosters on the side, it told me that I basically had exactly as much delta V as I needed in order to get into orbit around Duna. But the cheat sheet that I had is, you know, those are the numbers if you're absolutely precise and do everything in the most optimal way. And I still haven't put everything that I intended to onto the vessel, which meant that the delta V requirements were going to, or rather the full delta V of the craft would decrease as the weight got bigger. So then I came up with this idea of why not have a multi-staged ascender from the surface of Duna. And again, in retrospect, I probably could have just made a craft that could fly back up to Duna and not have to do that. Here we get to watch the procedure itself. So the top half of the spacecraft disconnects. Obviously, at this point, I have performed the crew transfer. Valentina, Bill, and Bob are in the lander. Jebediah is going to remain on board the command vessel. He's going to wait for his crew members to return from the surface of Duna while they do all of their fun little experiments and, you know, weather dust storms and meteor showers and all those other things that Kerbal Space Program doesn't have in it. But anyway, yeah, so this idea of having a lower stage to help it take off and then an upper stage to help it get into orbit was probably overkill. This could very easily have been done in a way. And then, you know, the lander would actually be reusable. But since this is a sandbox mode playthrough and I don't actually have any intention of revisiting Duna in this series, I don't suppose it really matters. I just do it for the immersion factor because I like doing things that way, you know, building extra spaces on spaceships than are necessary so my Kerbals have living space. Anyway, the landing itself you're watching, there was a simple retrograde burn that I used to target roughly target the area, but you're going to be coasting a very long time before your parachutes open up on Duna because the atmosphere is so thin that it doesn't do very much to slow you down. You're almost definitely going to have to go out on either very flat landing trajectory or use your boosters to slow you down to where the parachutes will allow you to open them. Similarly, you're going to want to decrease the minimum pressure at which they open because, again, the air pressure here is very low and you're going to want those parachutes to open in time. These parachutes don't actually slow the vessel down to a speed where it's not going to either crash or bounce and tip over. So I do end up using the boosters a bit, which I really hate to do because I don't want to use up the fuel that we need to take off again. But I do it anyway. It's because I generally tend to over-engineer my vessels, and I know that there is technically plenty of fuel left in this. This landing I also kind of messed up a couple of times. in ways that I had described earlier. So, you know, it would bounce and fall down, and basically make it impossible to take off again. But here we are. We have successfully landed on Duna. You have either Bill or Bob. I can't tell who it is in the preview screen because I can't read his name, but he is activating the little landing ladder. Because this is Duna, you can't necessarily rely on the EVA packs to climb back into command pods that are high above the ground. You got to put those ladders there. And there we have it, our first extravehicular activity on Duna. So of course we do the necessary portion of every mission, which is to plant a flag on the surface. And then once all of this science stuff has been done, once we're done living for months upon months upon months upon months on the surface of Duna, as you can see here in this time warp, we once again look for our transfer window back to Kerbin from Duna. In this case, the distance between the two, or rather the angle that the two have to enclose together is just under 90, so like 80-ish degrees, and Kerbin has to be behind Duna, which is important in this case. And then here we get to see the takeoff. So the bottom stage is going to have just enough fuel in it to almost get it into orbit, but not quite. We run out of fuel just before the periapsis can be raised above the surface of the planet. But that's perfect, because that means that the ascent stage is going to fall back down to Duna, crash, and instead of polluting space, we're going to be polluting the surface of a planet, which is acceptable for some reason. Polluting space is not, because that stuff can hit stuff, but at least on the surface of a planet, it's not going to cause any danger for now. There we are. You get to see me trying to get us up into an apoapsis to intersect our target's trajectory. Our target being the command vessel, and then here we get to watch the stage separation. There we go, and then those little monopropellant thrusters are going to send that pod back up into full Duna orbit, stable Duna orbit, which they have just entered. And then the next bit of this is going to be me performing. You don't get to watch the crash of the center stage, but trust me, it falls back down to Duna. And then here we're going to watch the approach and the docking. Again, in retrospect, you're going to see that I take this stage back home with me as well, but if I was really that keen on saving Delta V, I probably could have just let that stage fall back under the surface again, but you know, I wanted to take back as much of the original vessel with me as I could. Now, when you're docking with two crewed spaceships and not a ship and a station, you can do a little bit of a trick to make the docking sequence easier. You can switch to both vessels and make sure that the docking nodes are always autopilot. The autopilot on both vessels is pointing the noses or the docking ports towards each other, and that way all you have to do is accelerate, and the two ships are guaranteed to perfectly collide. It's not a trick I like to use because it's kind of unrealistic, but and I don't actually dock that way with space stations, because space stations don't generally tend to be that easy to maneuver, and they have a tendency to shake themselves to pieces if too many SAS modules are turned on. But once again, now that we have all of our crew back in orbit on the command vessel, we once again wait for our plotted maneuver node. This time, since we're headed back to a planet that is on a lower orbit than where we are, right? Duna has a higher orbit than Kerbin does. We have to be burning on the sunny side of the planet, because we are speeding up relative to Duna, but we are slowing down relative to the sun, so that we will end up decreasing our orbit to intersect with Kerbin. That's the basics of it. I hope that was easy to understand. Once you get to see a visualization, it might help a bit. So there we go, waving goodbye to Duna and Ike, who we have neglected to visit because he was... I mean, I like Ike, but he was not on our itinerary, so maybe in the future. I'm mostly focused on visiting the planets. This is obviously going to get a little bit more complicated once we get to Jewel, but you know what? Cross that bridge when we get there. Here I am once again messing around with the maneuver node to try and get us as close to the trajectory of the space station around Kerbin as I possibly can. In this case, it's important because our Delta V is starting to run low. And because the vessel just barely had enough Delta V to return back to the space station, is where I realize that I'm probably not going to be able to use this vessel in future episodes. I'm going to have to build new ones with greater Delta V capabilities, or do something that would really hurt me on a personal level and just ignore the space station, because all of those Delta V requirements of performing rendezvous and docking maneuvers on a return trip from an interplanetary destination would probably be negated if all I do is just re-enter Kerbin's atmosphere and, you know, have a single command pod to survive. But, you know, I generally like my spacecraft to be as reusable as possible. These big ships do eventually need to be deorbited and decommissioned, obviously, but until then, it's nice to have them in such a state that they can be reused multiple times. I'm not a big fan of wasting spacecraft. Here we get to watch our approach sped up back to Kerbin, and very soon now we're going to start. Yeah, we're going to witness the orbital insertion burn for Kerbin. Delta V is just barely enough to do all this. Because we did a pretty good orbital course correction on our way here, I kind of lucked out and ended up in a position where I barely needed any Delta V to slow myself down to the orbit of the space station. So it's going to be a pretty easy rendezvous and docking maneuver. At this point, these Kerbals have been in space for roughly 2 years, I believe. They spent most of that time in very low gravity environments, so again, it's a good thing Kerbals don't operate in the same way as humans do when it comes to, you know, muscle degeneration. Kerbals are powered by magic. We get to watch me performing the same docking maneuver that we did before, only now we're doing it on an approach from Duna instead of from Kerbin. Once again, we're gonna park it with the rear docking port, and of course, as you can see, this time the spacecraft is missing that orange fuel tank, which was the stage that we used to take off from Duna. So if I do ever want to take this craft back to Duna, in a world where this is a real space program and not just me playing a video game, right, then another one of those would need to be hauled up from the surface of Kerbin, which isn't honestly that big of a deal. I'd easily perform those maneuvers in orbit of Kerbin. But this just means that I need to be a little bit more clever with my spaceship design in the future. Anyway, to close out this mission, then we're going to transfer the crew back into their spacecraft, back into their Drake that's been hanging out here this entire time. And as the Drake slowly pushes away from the space station, it will carry its crew back to the surface of the planet in a fully recoverable fashion. So again, I'm really proud of myself because every little bit of that Drake is going to fly again. The only thing that we don't get back is the fuel that we burn, but I mean, that's pretty much the best you can do, right? And I also landed the booster and have video evidence of it. So that leaves me thinking, as we, you know, there's not really much for me to narrate as to the landing of the ship. It's very typical, you know, just a retrograde burn, try to aim for KSC as much as possible, bring it close. But then I am thinking now as to what my next destination should be. I went for Duna first because it's one of the easy ones that you want to tick off the list. But there's one planet in particular that I shall not name for now that I am dreading visiting because it's an absolute friggin' nightmare. And, you know, those of you who are Kerbal Space Program veterans or are familiar with the game and its planets, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you don't, then it will be a pleasant surprise. I'm actually honestly considering just leaving that planet out entirely from this playthrough, but knowing me, I probably won't. I'm gonna torture myself. I'm gonna suffer until I succeed doing it. All for your entertainment. That's a lie. I don't all do it. I do this mostly because I enjoy it. I enjoy playing Kerbal Space Program. It's my favorite game of all time. No game makes me feel the way KSP does. But anyway, that's enough. That's enough nostalgia for now. Probably what I'm going to do in the future is I'm going to take all the planets in the Kerbal system from the inside, from the lowest orbit to the highest orbit. But I might mix things up. And I'm also thinking of what else I can do to kind of mix up the missions, because I don't want it all to be just an Apollo style, fly to the planet, land on the planet, return home from the planet. So just like here, I kind of threw in that little extra, detaching of a stage over the unnecessary stage separation and the takeoff from Duna. I'm going to throw in a couple of extra things on future missions as well. Which again, I'm not gonna give away all of my plans for now, and there's nothing super original. I'm sure that other people have done a lot more interesting things than I can even think of, but this one is mine, and I am proud of it. I am proud that I managed to keep my 1 episode a week schedule up to this point, and I hope I get to continue doing this. I am in a pretty busy school year, so things in that area might end up interfering, but I will nonetheless do my best to set aside a couple of hours every week to bring you guys another Kerbal Space Program adventure. And then one day Kerbal Space Program 2 will come out, and I get to do all this stuff all over again, and so much more. Anyway, now that our crew has returned on a very nice soft water landing, I will depart, say goodbye with these beautiful pictures of a sunrise on Duna. Thank you very much for watching. Please, if you feel like it, take some time to give me a reaction to this video by either liking or commenting. Click on one of the recommended videos to see what other stuff I do. Check me out on the internet. Regardless, thank you very much for watching. It's great to have you here. I'll see you next time.